A stirring, a yearning, a twitch, an almost imperceptible change in posture. He'd been crouched in that same position, forearms on his thighs, hands dangling out over his knees, staring, eyes glazed, for well over an hour, though he didn't realize it. His sense of time had become hopelessly skewed long ago. It seemed to start and stop, slant and slide about with malevolent capriciousness. He was bogged down in a moment, a song stuck indefinitely on one unwavering note. His eyes blinked shut, remained closed for a short time, then raised ever so slowly. A camera shutter in tedious, overwrought slow motion. Abruptly, a gape-jawed feline yawn took hold of him, sending tremors down through his taut musculature. He rose to his feet, stretching, massaging sore knees and ankles, wincing at their sudden, unexplained tenderness. Harold remained unaware of his time slip, his loss of over an hour. He was mystified by what appeared to be the almost instantaneous onset of muscle cramps and joint soreness. It was an annoying distraction, one that had grown in frequency of late, though not to any great degree, not to the point of what could actually be referred to as worry. Very little actually concerned him enough to merit even a furrowed brow. He didn't own a clock, nor wore a watch, wasn't quite sure exactly how to tell time anyway. Nor did he have any appointments to keep. Therefore his paralytic episodes, seldom lasting to 2 hours, passed mostly unnoticed. A quirk of the light, a crick in his neck, drool on his shirt, nothing worthy of occupying his attention for more than a moment or so. The only thing that really could be said to occupy him to any meaningful extent at all was what he referred to as his work. With no thought in mind of completion or result, no conscious goal, he strived at it actively from virtually the time he was awake until he became tired and went to bed. His body, left free to set its own schedule, had slipped into a 26-hour day rather than the traditional 24. That meant he often found himself engaged in his work at night, a contingency for which he'd rigged up a number of floodlights, effectively lighting the woods around his home as if it were daylight, only with sharper, more contrasting shadow vistas. His home, set atop a narrow plateau on the side of a hill in eastern Kentucky, was little more than a shanty, a rickety shelter slapped carelessly together, an affront to architectural rhyme or reason. It was roughly a square, though if measured one would find that no side quite matched any other. Therefore, an asymmetrical square, a contradiction in geometric terminology admittedly, though not in the actual construction of Harold's house, an edifice in which it was plainly extant. The domicile, nestled on the lee slope of the hillside, had been thrown together with what materials he could scavenge at the time. Boards of varying length, width, age, and phylogenetic ancestry, wooden signs, the paint mostly chipped and faded into illegibility. Not that it mattered one whit to Harold. He couldn't read anyway. Driftwood, ragged sheets of discolored, dirt-caked, crumbling plastic, the occasional garbage bag, friable masses of cardboard and old cereal boxes, even a pie tin tacked up here and there. He hadn't the wherewithal to construct windows, so the only natural light that entered was through the myriad of gaps in the walls and tar-paper roof. He had managed, after a great deal of frustrating, tantrum-inducing trial and error, to install a door of sorts. Lacking any discernible frame, it hung loosely from hinges made from 4 dry-rotting slats of rubber, cut from a number of mismatched automobile tires. A steep, muddy foot trail wended its way from the front of the shanty, only a few precarious feet from the edge of the none too stable-looking outcropping. At the base of the hill was a makeshift mailbox, an old Folgers can nailed to the top of a 2x4, rammed at an oblique angle into the dirt. This was despite the fact that he didn't receive mail, and hadn't an address to speak of anyway. It had simply seemed like the right thing to do at the time. Essentially, Harold's house, of which he was honestly quite pleased, wouldn't even constitute a proper shed by most people's standards. Harold lifted one foot, struggling to maintain his nominal equilibrium, as he wriggled the stiffness out of one ankle, then repeated the process with the other, a curious backwoods jig. He looked appreciatively down at the object, or rather objects, at his feet. A battered, deeply abrased Cupid doll flanked by a rusted roller skate key and an almost empty, translucently faded blue Bic lighter with a missing flint, all three perched atop a crumbling cinder block. It was a perfectly symmetrical arrangement, one he'd meticulously labored over, getting just right. Perfectly, absolutely perfectly spaced for the better part of the afternoon. His eyes smiled. Harold took a couple steps back until his heels abutted a large mass-capped stone protruding adventurously from the earth, humus and woodland detritus behind him. He sought to view his latest piece in a wider, more holistic scope, in conjunction with the immediate area around it, than that within the greater whole of the hollow. The immediate region surrounding the little tableau held other, similar arrangements. Indeed, the entire valley in which he lived, from hilltop to hilltop, and virtually every square yard in between, was covered with them. A curious schismatic blend of cyclic nature and the monkey wrenchings of the non-biodegradable castaways of a disposable culture. In the autumnal spring sparseness of the forest, Harold's creations in colors or shades of colors, more or less undreamt of by Mother Nature, stood out in sharp contrast to the surroundings in which they were implacably placed. The preponderance of the pieces of utterly eclectic size, shape, and complexity rose up in blighted anti-aestheticism from whatever Harold was able to utilize as a suitably steady base. A rock, tree stump, the crook of a tree, a brick, an old tire, various makes and models of discarded appliances, cans of all sizes, the occasional warped and coagulated book, car parts, hunks of rotting lumber or rusted tin, anything and or everything. Others hung from string, wire, grungy shoelaces, strips of cloth, anything he could scavenge, poorly equipoised mobiles, twisting gallows fashion in the stale, languid stirring of the atmosphere, hardly spirited enough to refer to as even a light breeze. At first glance, the valley was an egregious testimonial to the dissonant clash between careless, living in the nonce humanity, and more punctilious nature. And were the trash, carried into the valley from illegal landfills via the river that flowed through its narrow basin, simply strewn indiscriminately about as if by flood, gale, or tornado, then that impression would steadfastly hold true. However, with the garbage arranged so carefully and lovingly, and on such a large scale, the scene adopted another tone entirely. The little idols, upon closer observation, had a peculiar monastic serenity about them, an almost pious reverence, a quality rendered uncomfortable only as a result of its unattractive subject matter, that being the decaying flotsam and jetsam of a culture too preoccupied by various shallow societal trappings to pick up after itself. Were the pieces constructed of other, more conventional, non-secular items, then, to the average individual, the valley would attain a sort of surreal placidity, a tranquil beauty, instead of the aura of quasi-religious mockery it currently flaunted. In addition to the obfuscate altars, attending them like staid little Praetorians, were candles, varying in quantity with the corresponding size of that which they were presumably meant to illuminate, and generally from 1 to 3 in number, though occasionally even 4 or 5 near some of the more impressive pieces. Unlike the altars, however, they were uniform in size, shape, and color, having been cast, each one individually, by Harold himself, from a single mold. The congruent little pips of palest white dotting the hillside bore a marked contrast to their chaotic, dissimilar surroundings. Each of them stood a stout 1 foot tall and 8 inches in diameter. The tallow from which they'd been cast was of an unusually wan pallor, almost, but not quite, translucent. When the sunlight hit them at just the right angle, undiffused by an overhead canopy of summer umbrage, an onlooker could almost discern the faint adumbrations of something sealed within. Undefined shadows vaguely organic in shape, small pieces of a once much larger whole. The poorly demarcated shades bore an uncomfortable familiarity, reminiscent of tiny portions of humanity, waxen specimen jars containing what surely couldn't possibly be there. Best to dismiss them as mere chicanery of the light, or irregularities in texture, than to contemplate the possibility that one's imagination wasn't running roughshod over common sense. Additionally, not a one of them had been lit. Not a single wick bore evidence of flame. Their pristine quality added a touch of suspense to the entire scene, set one's mind to wondering exactly what the occasion was for which they were being so diligently preserved. Satisfied that he'd positioned his latest work in exactly the place it had uniquely demanded, content that it fit just right into the patterns only he could discern, the jimmy-rigged constellations by which he navigated, Harold turned and trekked back down the hillside. Rather than traversing the rickety footbridge he'd carelessly pieced together from structurally unreliable chunks of this and that, he knelt down at the bank of the stream, only occasionally blossoming into a full-fledged river, and began sifting through the numinous alluvium from which he drew the raw materials of his work. His inspiration, though such an abstract concept never entered into his conscious mind, welled up from a different source entirely. A new awareness dreamed. Like a sleeper on the cotton-headed edge of waking, it drifted in and out of consciousness, a slow, aqueous fluctuation between two worlds, an oscillation between existence and combinations possible only occasionally, and only in the rare places that hadn't either a beginning nor an end, just were. A furnace of thought flared, more heat than light. It was fissioning, splitting. It gathered mass, equanimity of negative and positive. An infinite nothing, storing inertia and feeling momentum. It dangled a sluggish finger in the stuff of the universe, like a woman half asleep in a tiny rowboat adrift on the ocean, hanging her hand languorously into the water, causing ripples that laughed specifically at the Milky Way galaxy, at the solar system, on the shores of the cradle of humanity, and against the beachhead of the simple soul of Harold. A new God struggled in the confining birth canal of the will-be toward the light of the is. He stirred restless, eager to assume his place on a vast new vacant throne, to stride with fearful purpose across the mountains and nations of earth. He would humble doting Mother Nature, grind her vain glory beneath his heel, despoil her beauty. The Lord of the approaching new eon, his rule absolute, unwavering in purpose, despotic in implementation, brutal, pure, free of the taint of mercy. He will come for the lost, the passed over, for the misruled and misdirected, for the preterite. All other gods will be arbitrarily cast down, anchored into the abyss by their obsolescence and their unwieldy grandiose titles, delivered into the clutching, rending hands of the resentful mob. He will be the hungry, viral god of devouring, the eater of life, the remorseless killer of the old, effectively dormant gods of nature and their attendant elements. The time was nigh, and the old gods had, for whatever reason, neglected to fulfill their original purpose, had lost their way, grown stagnant and cocksure in their rule, impotent and irresponsibly dissolute. Their worship neglected, lain fallow, and they had grown weak in their debauches, inattentive to duty. The new god, the angry and vengeful child, would collectively usurp all their aimless and dejected congregations, melt them down into a singular hammer of vengeance, wrought solely for the bloody demolition of Earth's hollow temple. He would use them to sweep away the sear husks of his progenitors, and then turn their nascent, untrammeled violence upon themselves, forcing stellar diaspora. Either that or extinction. Whichever, it mattered not to him. The gods of fecundity, of the green, the incompetent directors of all that crawled, swam, skittered, or flew within the womb of Earth's atmosphere, had failed. It was time for new blood. The god of the landfill, the illegal dump, the trailer park, the satellite dish, of pollution, of excess, of those whose lives were empty and adrift without purpose, those without pride or drive, the human animals, the shanty folk, the dwellers in the clinging dirt of the body and the dust of the soul, the white trash, the nigger, the lowest of the low, the inbred, the spick, the wop, the detritus of every society. He will uplift them all, raise them with egalitarian, tyrannical fervor. Unlike those who preceded him with empty maxims and less than useless aphorisms, he will indeed be no respecter of persons, lumping all humanity into a unified aggregate, then shattering it against the vault of the Empyrean, shattering it amongst the stars, burning their bridges, forcing their destiny upon them with a martial, inexorable beat. It was time for humanity to evolve yet again, and toward that purpose it required a guide, a cosmic herdsman, to provide it with the impetus intrinsic in a clean, ineluctable direction, a singular focus. His will was to drive suckling humanity from the sear, withering breast of its mother, to sever gravity's umbilical cord. It was lain before him to shatter the hearth to 1,000 million pieces, to promulgate the seed before the blossom dried and fell to ash, to open the door and set the house aflame, to propitiate humanity beyond its despoiled Eden. His binnacle trembled, inner compass locked fierce on magnetic north, repulsed from within toward without, incubation at an end. He burned molten, searing away his cowl, allowing light to penetrate his vision, to tattoo his engendered intrinsic purpose upon the forefront of his consciousness, brand him with juggernaut force of will. Galaxies whirled at his core engine, rotating with lissome fluidity, a placid motion, belying his irascible temperament. The long, millennia-old struggle toward life, toward fulfillment, was coming to an end. a product tailor-made in the bowels of the universal forge, custom-fitted by a vast intellect to the task at hand. He awaited his simultaneous birth and coronation, the moment he assumed his mantle of ruination and decay, the lightning of the torch that will burn the grove to fallow, impotent, eddying ash, in order to preserve the faltering forest as a whole. His gestation virtually complete, he awaited the final spark that would melt the seal and ignite the conflagration. The time was nigh. Harold pulled a bottle from the muddy embankment, then jiggled it in the stream to wash away the clotted remainder of the river bed. Wet and glistening, he turned the piece over in his hand, scrutinizing it with a connoisseur's eye. It was a sharply, vaguely feminine perfume bottle, deep blue at one time, though sunlight and exposure faded to the wan blue of a clear sky on a thickly humid day. On the bottom, stamped discreetly into whatever it was the bottle had been cast from, was the word Avon. He wasn't exactly sure to what it referred, was unable to read it, as he was illiterate, but it did look moderately familiar, was certain he'd seen that symbol before on other pieces he'd collected. Though not exactly what he was looking for at the moment, he tucked it into one of the deep utilitarian pockets of his overalls, sure he'd find a use for it later. Despite the fact that he didn't have in his possession one of those items he'd specifically been searching for, a steel RC can with one side rusted partially away, he rose, clambered back up the slick, fairly steep embankment, and trundled across his vertiginously unsteady, misaligned footbridge to the other side. He believed he had another similar piece or two up in his cabin that would do as an ersatz replacement. The thin plateau, most likely the result of a deadfall occurring a century or more ago, upon which Harold had pieced together his tumble-down home, provided him the ideal vantage point from which to survey the fruits of his labors. He stood there, bent forward into the breeze, wafting vigorously through the valley, and sighed, struck by the beauty of what he'd accomplished. He scanned the panorama with meticulous slowness, rotating himself to view it from one end to the other. The wind droned an elegiac dirge, filling the atmosphere with a deeply resonant, variable tone. Harold felt the song vibrating low in his bowels, nature's premier soloist singing a lugubrious hymn to the coming age, an almost palpable lamentation. The sloped walls of the valley, the chapel al fresco, set up an echoic interplay, rendering the solo into a fugue, an endlessly constant, endlessly diminishing doxology to the coming age. Harold hummed absently along with it, following the capricious melody as best he could. He held up his hands, making them visible in the periphery of his vision, fingers splayed, palms out, as if inspecting the dirt clotted beneath his yellowed nails. What a breathtaking wonder he'd wrought with those hands! A magnificent chapel, a votive garden dedicated to a being of which he was only cursorily aware, a force of which he had little comprehension. He only knew that he loved, without question or need of explanation, and the valley was his expression of that limitless devotion, his faith both deep and wide. Over the years, the better part of a decade, he'd striven to place each piece in the exact place, at the exact angle he envisioned, every one of them in accord with the vivid, explicit vision in his head, a proper and unalterable place for each. He imagined a golden thread, a strand of light, wending its way elaborately along the valley floor and walls, across the ridge tops, intersecting with each piece, every one a focus. He could discern patterns, mathematical and geometric complexities he was congenitally unable to comprehend, a living admonition in a graceful arcane tongue, the word given form and substance. It was the speech, the supernal means by which the coming new dawn was to be summoned forth, and it lacked only 2 or 3 more pieces being complete, the final syllables and the palpable invocation. Harold retired into his cabin, where he began sifting carefully, reverentially through the garbage he'd piled, stacked, sorted, and displayed in every conceivable location within the tiny, squalid hovel. Stamped upon his mind was the blueprint for the next altar he was to construct, more elaborate than the previous one, as it would require considerably more individual components. Moving from pile to pile, shelf to shelf, table to chair to milk crate to floor, he patiently, scrupulously sought that one perfect, specific item. Locating it at last, he held it triumphantly aloft, blackened, decayed stumps of teeth visible amidst a boyish grin. As quickly as it appeared, the smile faded, his lips becoming in an instant flaccid and expressionless. His body grew rigid, his muscles taut like those of a bird sleeping perched upon a wire. The light faded from his eyes, replaced with a lusterless 1,000-yard stare. His breathing hitched once, twice, then became shallow and consistent, shifted at once into a weak, idle, bordering dormancy. His consciousness flickered and died like a flame deprived of oxygen, and his unconscious rose to the forefront of his silent mind, opening its singular inner eye. A force stuffed it with pure, untainted information, vital quantum bits of knowledge which it sank into the depths of Harold's brain, designed to float to the surface at the appropriate time, under the appropriate circumstances. They were the final set of instructions, the last of the preparations needed to make ready the path, to ensure the unhindered arrival of the Lord of the new church. Roughly a half-hour later, Harold's smile spontaneously returned. He turned the object in his hand, a blue soda can speckled with rust, at arm's length, appreciated the way in which the faceted beams of light, issuing at oblique angles through the gaps in his walls, played upon its dull, patented surface. It would suit the requirement nicely, was more than adequate. Satisfied that all the components for his latest work were attendant, either in hand or in pocket, he turned and pushed his way back out the front door, his only door, wincing a bit at the sudden soreness in his right shoulder, the tightness of fatigue. He stood there in front of his house, a tiny, bent man, enraptured by his achievement, inebriated by the imminent closure of his life's work. He raised his arms out from his sides, standing victoriously cruciform, symbolically, if not literally, embracing his beloved chapel, the name of his coming Lord's church, the center of an inchoate new religion, the faith of waste, disillusion, discard, and pollution, an orgiastic surfeiture in their activities most blatantly anathemic to the cradle of humanity, a wild bacchanalian severing of the planetary umbilical, a mass proselytizing of the preterite. Harold shouted to the top of his lungs in ecstatic, epiphanous abandon, adding his voice to that of the wind. Soon it would be time to light the candles to ignite the spark, the harbinger of the coming conflagration. Harold envisioned the seat of his devotion aglow with thousands of tiny firebrands, collectively fusing into a new northern star, a new star of Bethlehem. His eyes smiled, alight with an inner fire.